This is your number one station.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
And we're back. Unfortunately, we're seeing more suicides and more young people dying. Tragedy, which could and should be averted, but we're not really talking about as much as we should. Our guest right now is somebody who hosts a brand new show on the Talkline Network, Heart to Heart. Leigh Yafee joins us. The show, she's also with The Long Short Road, and they deal with suicide and other issues and trying to prevent that. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I'm sorry that this is the reason that we're here, but it's so important that we discuss this topic. So thanks for having me on to.
No, important. My heart went out. I heard about a young man that was shot dead by a gun in Muncie just the other day, and I've come across families with fentanyl and others where we're seeing tragedy, young people who are really starting out life and just being snuffed out, and something which we have to talk about. Tell us about your organization, what you're doing regarding this particular issue, unfortunately.
Sure. So I run an organization called The Long Short Road. We're dedicated to fostering resilience through suicide prevention and mental wellness education. And I started the organization in 2019, but I've been working in suicide prevention since 2016. And I got started with young people, with high school and college age students. Unfortunately, suicide is the second leading cause of death in youth. And I should mention that even though the statistics that we have access to are from secular sources, I have seen from lived experience and from having my boots on the ground for so many years in this issue that this is an issue that is affecting the frum community as much as it is in the secular world. We have crisis management services. We provide suicide prevention classes to empower everyone from parents to educators to first responders to mental health professionals to understand the issue of suicide, to not be afraid to discuss suicide with people in their lives, and to make this this difficult topic an accessible conversation so that we can save more lives. And we know from the research and from lived experience that when we can talk about suicide in a way that is compassionate and provides safety and security and compassionate well-being towards the people who are struggling, we can help prevent this terrible thing from occurring.
In your professional opinion, why are we seeing more suicides, including in the frum community?
So I think that there's many causes and conditions, and it's difficult to bottle it down into one particular issue, right? There's no two people struggle for the same reason. That being said, the uptick can be contributed to, we're seeing many more people who have experienced abuse, trauma, neglect, difficult life circumstances that contribute to their suicidal ideation. Well, actually, before I give you the reasons, I just want to share one thing that I think is important for people to understand and to know. A mind in distress, a person whose mind is in distress, does not behave in the same way as someone who's not in distress, right? So the reasons for that there could be many reasons for that, right? So significant history of abuse or trauma or neglect, bullying among teenagers. This is something that we do not realize how bad of an issue this is, but bullying in schools is such a risk factor and such a contributing factor to mental health challenges and to suicidal ideation. Social media is a contributing factor. In general, the teen years, and I don't just mean 13 to 18, ages 10 through 30, the period of adolescence, the developmental period of adolescence, is a very challenging time developmentally for a person's brain. They're much more risk averse. They're much more likely to do things that are dangerous to themselves or others. They're much less likely to be thinking logically or rationally about the things that they're doing. But I think I'll be honest with you. I think that the issue of suicide has always been prevalent in our community. And I think what's changing now is that we're waking up to the fact that it's prevalent. I do think that the numbers are higher, but I don't want it to sound like this has never been an issue in the frum community, and only in the last 15 years has this become prominent. Like this has been present for decades. But yeah, it definitely is. It is. I think people are realizing that it's here in our community, and it's not just something that's affecting the outside world.
In your show on Thursday night, this past Thursday night, I was struck by, from what you and your guests were saying, that a lot of suicide, a good portion, maybe most of them, could be prevented.
Yes. And I do want to, especially in light of the fact that we're having this conversation, unfortunately, after a suicide death, I do, first of all, want to extend, my compassion and condolences to the family. It's so heartbreaking and such a devastating and unnecessary loss. And when we say suicide is preventable, sometimes that can be triggering for people who have lost someone to suicide. Like, oh, if it's preventable, then it must have been my fault that person died and I could have done something about it. So that being said, I look at suicide as preventable in the same way that cancer, doesn't have to be terminal. That when someone receives a cancer diagnosis, you do everything you can, everything in your power to support that person and help them heal. Does it mean that we're going to be able to save every person? No. But what we know from the research, and also what I can tell you from lived experience, is that we can prevent suicide, and that it doesn't, suicide is a symptom of underlying causes. It's not who the person is. It's not their identity. It's not, we tend to link when we hear that someone is struggling with suicide, we make that who they are. And there's issues underneath the surface that are leading to that. If we can deal with those core issues, and if we can help them get on a path of healing, it doesn't mean that their issues are going to go away overnight, or that their suicidal ideation or intent will go away overnight. It won't. It's a journey. There's a reason why my organization is called The Long Short Road, because it is a long road, right? But it's possible and it's doable. And when we can approach people who are struggling with any sort of challenge with compassion and humility, and be willing to provide non-judgmental support, and give them that relational safety, they have more ability to tap into their own innate tools for healing.
Well, you mentioned on the air the other night that, and this I found surprising, that if you are compassionate and ask somebody who is a suicide possibility, if you ask, are you contemplating suicide, most of them will be honest with you and tell you that.
Yes. And it's
surprising.
It is surprising. And, that's actually something that was very surprising for me when I first got started in this area, in this field, is that if you are concerned about someone in your life, if it's a student or a child or your spouse or your sibling or a coworker, and you feel compelled to ask them about suicide, when you do it in a way that's direct, clear, and kind, that can spark a conversation that can lead to life and not death. That being said, having one conversation, or even 3 conversations, or 10 conversations with someone, and being direct and honest and clear, doesn't guarantee that they're not going to struggle, or that they're not going to even continue struggling with suicide. But when we can make it an open conversation, we show them, when we can show people that we're not afraid of this topic, it gives them the space and to know, here's someone who I can trust, and they'll be with me in this healing process.
What are some of the signals that one should look for to alert you to say, hey, this person might be contemplating suicide?
Okay, so I like to call them invitations, things that people do that invite us in to pay attention. Things like talking about death or dying, giving away their belongings, posting alarming things on social media, significant changes in behavior, not caring about things they used to care about, changes.
These are all signals of somebody maybe contemplating suicide.
Well, yes, and you can see these kinds of behaviors, but you won't know unless you ask. Because you can look at these kinds of behaviors and can say, oh, but that's linked to a struggle they're having in their family, or that could be linked to a mental illness that they're struggling with. it's not so straightforward to say, oh, these are the things that are for sure about suicide. If you see something, you have to say something, right? If you're observing that there are things that are happening that are alarming to you, it's important to speak up and say, hey, this is what I'm noticing, and ask the question in a direct way. Not in a judgmental, accusatory way, but in a compassionate, I'm here for you and I want to help you and I'm not afraid of you or of this issue kind of way.
Do we have any statistics? Do we know how many? Because I know people don't like talking about it, but I hear murmurs that this one's, lost a child, suicide. This one lost a child before suicide. Do we have any numbers knowing how many and how big of a problem this is in our community?
Unfortunately, we don't have those numbers. And that people have been asking me about that for years. And I feel like it's imperative that we get that research. Maybe that's something that the Long Short Road needs to take on. People have asked me that question enough times. And I'm like, maybe we need to do it. We don't have that data. And part of the reason is exactly because of the way you ask the questions, Zev, is like people don't want to talk about it. So
I mean, I even heard cases where a child committed suicide, the parents won't even attend the funeral. I've heard crazy stories like that. I mean,
breaks my heart.
It breaks my heart too. And I think it's a small number, but I've heard stories because they're afraid that if it gets out there, it'll hurt the shidduchim prospects of the other children at home. As crazy as that sounds, and I'm not looking to condemn them. The parents are in pain. I'm sure of it.
Of course, but there is a massive stigma around this issue still. As open-minded as we are, I think that the frum community has made leaps and bounds when it comes to mental health. There's not a single community that is not addressing mental health challenges today. And it's beautiful. When I started in suicide prevention 9 years ago, it felt like no one was talking about this. And now it's become much more common. Where I gave a training at a Chabad house on the Upper East Side. I think this was over 3 years ago. And I said something about stigma and how prevalent stigma is in the Orthodox community and in the Jewish community. And someone raised their hand and he was like, I don't think stigma is still an issue in the Jewish community. I was like, wow, you must live in a community where people are really open and really have eradicated the sense of shame, because I see it everywhere.
Unfortunately, people, listen, I'm embarrassed even to go to a therapist. I heard a great story about a therapist where I think a well-known rabbi took a congregant to a therapy session, and while his congregant was in the therapy session, he noticed somebody else from his congregation in the therapist office. So he walks over, he goes, "Please don't tell anybody that I'm here." to help him to deal with it, which I thought is a great, heartwarming story. But there's a stigma even going to a therapy, or to a therapist, or a therapy session, and I think we're overcoming it, but it's still an issue in our community. Yes,
and to your point about what you said about shidduchim, I have spoken to hundreds of families over the years. I speak directly to parents, to the teens who are struggling, to concerned family members. And many times the first question that they'll ask me is not, how can we help this kid heal? How can we make sure that they get the tools they need, or what's the best program to send them to? But what are we going to do about the family? They have siblings in shidduchim, or they're in shidduchim, or what's the reputation of the family going to be? And I can understand where they're coming from, but also at the same time, if we're talking about pikuach nefesh, shidduchim don't really matter right now. What matters is keeping the person alive and safe, and helping them feel safe and seen and soothed, and showing them that they're loved no matter what, not making them feel like a worse off burden by making it about, oh, what are people going to think?
So let me ask you this question. If somebody sees in the family somebody who they think might be potentially contemplating suicide, what should they be doing?
The first is checking in with their own judgment and their own biases before they have a conversation, and making sure they're ready to have that conversation.
Not to be judgmental when they have a conversation with them.
Because we can have the best of intentions. If we show up to a conversation, if I'm concerned about someone and I come to them and be like, hey, I just want to make sure that you're not thinking about suicide. You're not going to do that, right? There's a way to frame the question. There's a way to have the conversation. I think for every person, for every family, it's different. For every individual, it's different. It's working with the individual. It's us versus the issue, not me and you, not me versus you. It's me and you versus this challenge that you're facing. Let's figure out together how we can help you heal. For every person, that's going to look a little different. I have seen a lot of success for people who are struggling with suicidal ideation with trauma-based or somatic-based therapies, therapies like DBT or EMDR. For some people, medication is needed. For some people, hospitalization or a residential treatment program is needed. There's so many causes and conditions and ways to support a person. But really, what I've learned from so many years of doing this is that what's in our control is not how they heal, but what kind of relationship we have with them. And that relational experience can be very healing. I can't remember if I spoke about it on Thursday night or if it was a different, I think maybe it was last week's episode. This idea that through our relationships and through providing safety and security and being able to soothe and co-regulate and provide emotional and physical support for individuals who are struggling, we can really help empower them to access their innate tools. So can we, I've seen this so many times where well-meaning parents will say, I've made the therapy appointment for them. I've driven them to the appointment. I leave their medication for them on the table. I do all this stuff and they're still not getting better. You can't do the healing for them, right? But you can be there for them while they're walking that journey, as challenging as it is. And the journey is challenging. It's not a straightforward process, unfortunately. I wish it was. I would like to retire from the area of suicide prevention, to be perfectly honest.
Unfortunately, getting busier, it's not getting better, it's getting worse, but more people willing to talk about it, which I think is the only silver lining in this very sad topic.
Yes.
Leigh Yafee doing wonderful work. The group is called The Long Short Road. The radio show, which on every Thursday night at 9 o'clock, is called Heart to Heart. If people want to learn more about what you're doing, how can they do so?
They can visit us on Instagram at The Long Short Road. Our website is thelongshortroad.com. They can also reach out via email, info@thelongshortroad.com.
Thank you for all that you're doing, and continuous success in trying to prevent suicides. It's something which we need to speak a lot more about, and thank you for speaking up and doing it on a regular basis. So continued success.
Thank you so much.
Leigh Yafee here on the Talkline Network. When we come back, we'll speak to the chief rabbi of Ukraine. We'll speak about what really happened between Zelensky and President Trump, and then our feature president